Hello and welcome to Leaker's Digest. Welcome ye lucky few. Welcome ye boomers, Generation X, Millennials, Gen Z, and even, I guess, perhaps in the future, some Generation Alphas may be watching this. So, have a lovely look at this generational chart. Have some time to familiarize yourself with it. I think it's pretty interesting, actually. It's very well done. But essentially, the question today is that, is Gen Z more conservative than previous generations? In recent history, pretty much every generation that has succeeded the last one has been more liberal than the last one. And so there's a lot of talk about whether Gen Z is more conservative than millennials or not. Some studies seem to indicate that while Gen Z is still overwhelmingly liberal and perhaps more liberal than Gen Y, millennials, it is the first generation in a long time to start shifting slightly more conservative. I was born in 1998, which is sort of on the cusp between Gen Y and Gen Z. And of course, here's a chart showing differences in party affiliation by generation. And of course, as it shows, it's very much correlated with age, and that younger age groups tend to lean more liberal. But when you look at the political breakdown in terms of generations, and you also look at Gen Z, you see something interesting then. So what we see is that Gen Z has a significantly higher undecided portion than other generations, and the smallest proportion in both very conservative and very liberal. At this point, you're going to meet Yuri Bezmenov, who was a propagandist for the Soviet Union and defected to the West.
Mr. Bezmenov was born in 1939 in a suburb of Moscow. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet Army officer. He was educated in the elite schools inside the Soviet Union and became an expert in Indian culture and Indian languages. He had an outstanding career with Novosti, which was and still is, I should say, the press arm or the press agency of the Soviet Union. It turns out that this is also a front for the KGB. He escaped to the West in 1970 after becoming totally disgusted with the Soviet system, and he did this at great risk to his life. He certainly is one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures. Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in four basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans.
So let's look at some party history. Why do Democrats tend to do better with youth? Yes, younger generations do tend to be more liberal generally, but the Democratic Party was strongly associated with the youth vote back in the Flower Power movement. Strong anti-war sentiment, specifically in regards to the Vietnam War in the late 60s, was crucial in shifting the cultural significance of the two-party system. Shifting parties. Prior to the 1960s, both the parties had significant liberal and conservative wings, but over time, the Democrats became synonymous with liberals and Republicans with conservatives. Many liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats shifted parties, but at that time, the partisan divide was much smaller than it is today. And you can see that in the late 1800s, it was very polarized, similar to how it is today, and around the World War II era, it was the less polarized it has been in recent time. And of course now, we see highly polarized again. Due to the shifting political and cultural landscape, the Republican Party became generally known as the Establishment Party. Even though at times the Republican Party was not the majority party, it became increasingly associated with the wealthy, the well-connected, and the older generations. The Republicans also became increasingly seen as more backwards than conservative. They were and are often accused of racism, sexism, and xenophobia. During this time period, the Democratic Party gained the strong majority of the ethnic minority, youth, and female voting base. But what was the political landscape prior to the 1960s? Let's look at a brief history of the Democratic Party. The first president from the Democratic Party was Andrew Jackson, a president widely considered by Democrats today to be one of the most racist presidents the country has had. The Democratic Party seceded from the Union to establish the Confederacy when the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected. The only states which passed Jim Crow laws were Democrat-controlled. The KKK was founded by the Democratic Party and had historically endorsed Democratic candidates. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This amendment was passed with 100% Republican support and only 23% Democrat support. And down there you can actually see the vote chart layout, and that is from YouGov. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The major provision of the 14th Amendment was to grant citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, thereby granting citizenship to former slaves. 94% Republican support, 0% Democrat support. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the federal government and each state from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 100% Republican support, 0% Democrat support. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the states and federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex. 82% Republican support, 54% Democrat support. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark civil rights and labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and later, sexual orientation. It prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools and public accommodations, and employment discrimination. 80% Republican support, 61% Democrat support. How can this be? Is my life a lie? In fact, the Republican Party was founded as the Abolitionist Party, and until the era of FDR, African Americans were the strongest voting bloc for the Republican Party. This brings me to my next point. How did this all change? And why wasn't I taught this in school? I had received almost entirely the opposite idea from what history I'd learned of the parties in school. Very reasonably, the Democratic Party eventually realized it would need to radically rebrand itself in order to shed its ugly past, or else they would no longer be competitive. And you can also see some Democratic propaganda from back in the day. Obviously, a very different marketing plan from then to now. So, rebranding, shifting strategy. Beginning in the 1960s, the Democratic Party would begin to more wholeheartedly embrace civil rights and slowly weed out overt racists. Although former Ku Klux Klan members would continue to serve as Democrats in the House and Senate until as late as 2010, see Robert Byrd. The Democratic strategy, under President Lyndon Johnson specifically, began dramatically shifting towards aggressively labeling the Republicans as racist, projecting their own flawed history on the opposition. During the same time period, President Johnson enacted the War on Poverty, various social programs with the seemingly benign goal of fighting poverty. This would, however, lead to the creation of the welfare state and effectively purchase huge amounts of Democratic votes from traditionally Republican populations, essentially holding social benefits ransom for votes. Since the Civil War, the Democratic Party had always branded itself as the underdog. In the post-civil rights era, this messaging would be extended to appeal to ethnic minorities, youth, and women. The Democratic Party was experienced in using division tactics in order to garner support. They only needed to adapt those tactics to new audiences. By embracing and weaponizing identity politics and championing the civil rights they had once opposed, they would slowly accrue popular and institutional support. The danger of identity politics. Division projection. Identity politics has been used by many parties and regimes throughout history to create division between groups for political gain, most notably used by the Nazis and various communist regimes. Identity-based politics always has a common thread. One group has been victimized and marginalized by another, and therefore is deserving of some sort of retribution. An eye for an eye. An enhanced sense of victimization in a population has been a prerequisite for nearly all genocides in recent history. We often question how the average German citizen could have gone along with the Holocaust, and the answer is identity politics and feeling victimhood. You always hear, Trump is dividing us. But is that true? There is no evidence that racial division in America benefits Trump or the Republicans. Just the opposite. The more racial and political division in America means more votes for the Democratic Party. It makes sense when you think about it. If you believe that the average American is good-hearted and against racism, then all social indicators and peer pressure would push voters to support the Democratic Party. The clear tactic used is guilt tripping. Messaging from the Democratic Party is that America is inherently racist, hopelessly flawed, and that you are contributing to systemic racism if you don't vote Democrat.
Equality, mind you. President Kennedy once said, we will make America to believe that people are born equal. Are people born equal? Is there any mentioning in the Bible or any other holy scripture in any religion, if you don't believe me, go to the library and check it. There is not a single word about equality, just the opposite. By your deeds, God will judge you. What you do is important, the merit of your personality. You cannot legislate equality. Some people are tall and stupid. Others are short, bold, and clever. If we make them equal by force, if we put the principle of equality in the basis of our socio-political structure, it's the same thing as building a house on sand. Sooner or later, it will collapse, and that's exactly what happens. And we, as Soviet propaganda makers, are trying to push you in the direction which you go yourself. Equality, yes, equality, people are equal. Democracy, as it was established by fathers of this country, of this system in the last century, is not equality. It's the system where different people, unequal people, have a chance to survive and help each other in constant competition, in constant perfection. Not inequality, which is superimposed from a godfather or a nice person in Washington, D.C. So, the moment you bring a country to the point of almost total demoralization, when nothing works anymore, when you are not sure whether it is right or wrong, good and bad, but there's no division between evil and good, when even the leaders of church sometimes say, well, violence for the sake of justice, especially social justice, is justified in countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, well, maybe Rhodesia, and we listen to them and say, yeah, probably it's true. Is it true? No, it is not true. Violence is not justified, especially for the sake of quote-unquote social justice introduced by Marxist-Leninists, that is my former colleagues from Novosti Press Agency. Okay, so we reach that point. The normal, traditionally accepted relations are destabilized. The relations between teachers and students in schools and colleges fight.
Look at me.
Yes.
Look at me.
Yes.
Your experiences will never connect to mine. Empathy is not necessary for you to understand that you're wrong.
Proclaiming that cultural appropriation on Halloween is totally permissible is hurtful.
I want to make sure. I don't hear that.
I'm looking at the smirk in your face and I'm disgusted.
Okay.
But now I am actually angry, sir. I really do not interrupt me. I was not angry, and now I want your job to be taken from you.
We cannot solve our problems anymore. The society at large becomes more and more antagonistic between individuals, between groups of individuals, and the society at large. The media puts himself in the opposition to the society in general, at large, separate, alienated.
I also think that it might, I I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
No matter what, it's black against white, yellows against green, doesn't matter where the division line goes. As long as this group come into antagonistic clash, sometimes militantly, sometimes with firearms, that is destabilization.
The Western Enlightenment, countering identity politics. Our government is based upon many of the ideals which came from Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke. What the Enlightenment thinkers realized centuries ago was the antidote to divisive identity-based politics. When you begin to divide people into groups based on arbitrary characteristics they were born with, it gets out of hand pretty quickly. The academic left refers to this problem as intersectionality. However, you can only divide people so much until you get down to the level of the individual, and this is what the Enlightenment thinkers realized. The individual is the greatest minority, and this is why government should be set up with the goal of protecting individual rights, not group rights. Cultural hegemony. Appear weak when you are strong. Despite maintaining the underdog status in the public perception, the Democratic Party was able to accrue massive institutional power in the second half of the 20th century. Art, literature, mass media, journalism, entertainment, sports, and academia all began to skew noticeably liberal following the Flower Power movement. By the time I was born in 1998, the Democratic Party had successfully established a cultural hegemony on nearly all forms of media and entertainment. The process has accelerated rapidly in the time since Donald Trump has taken office, with big tech and Silicon Valley proudly virtue signaling their liberal bias. While maintaining the appearance of underdog status, the Democratic Party now receives far more money from super PACs, major corporations, and Wall Street. Despite being a well-known billionaire, Donald Trump's campaign spent only about half the amount spent by the Clinton campaign. Donald Trump was able to draw about $280 million from small donors giving $200 or less. While Trump was far underfunded, he has consistently had a higher amount of small donors giving $200 or less. Trump won the presidency despite having raised less than any major party presidential nominee since John McCain in 2008, the last to accept federal funds to pay for his general election contest. He is similarly being outpaced in terms of total funding this year, but has significantly more small donors who are funding a much higher proportion of his campaign. Here you can see the breakdown of the fundraising for the Clinton campaign and the Trump campaign in 2016. And here are two graphs comparing where those donations came from. And so you can see that the Trump campaign received a much higher proportion of their funding from small donors, donations of less than $200. And here is the top individual donors to Clinton and Trump. And of course, as you can see, Donald Trump funded his own campaign to the tune of $66 million. Which may seem like a lot, but it was only less than 10% of the total funding, and much less of the funding that Hillary Clinton received in total. So if Trump and the Republicans aren't creating all this division, who is?
Far broader than the Russian objective to either help one candidate or hurt the other was the goal of undermining our democracy. Sowing discord in the United States.
In 2016, among other things, the Russians mimicked Black Lives Matter to push out content to racially divide people.
The Russian trolls, hundreds of them, were paid to turn Americans against each other, an old strategy of divide and conquer.
They look at movements that are popular, they look at trends and topics that they see have taken ground in the US, and then they replicate it.
So the Russians saw these protests taking place and decided, we want more of that.
Yes, they decided this is divisive and we're going to be in the middle of it.
The Russians view these divisions within our society as a weakness. Indeed, they are a weakness, and there's something that we need to focus on being able to bridge.
But I got to tell you, you know, I said, and it's probably get me in trouble, but I said to some of my colleagues recently, so I know that it's an issue, But it seems like every single day on television I'm talking about race, and it's because of the news cycle, it's in the news, but sometimes I get so tired of talking about it, I want to just go, this is over, can we move on?
And if you talk about it, it exists.
Right.
Yeah. It's not like it exists and we refuse to talk about it, but making it a bigger issue than it needs to be is the problem we have.
Again, sounds hard to believe, doesn't it?
Race to me is the perfect storm for the media. They love racial animosity. The media loves, first of all, they love anything that's controversial, but race is the perfect storm for them.
So the press has to be responsible. They're not being responsible.
And that's why we are here right now. That's where we are.
How are we going to get rid of racism until...
Stop talking about it.
Journalism. Journalists inherently tend to side with and advocate for the underdog position, for the simple reason that it's more popular to root for the underdog. Less than 10% of journalists identify themselves as Republicans in 2013, and one can see the trend over time is that fewer journalists identify themselves as Republican, and significantly more identify as independent. Although, Don Lemon calls himself an independent, so...
I mean, it's not funny, but it's just laughable. The mind boggles.
Academia. Similarly, less than 10% of college professors identify as Republican, and nearly half of all top colleges don't have a single registered Republican professor on staff. Many colleges refuse to allow conservative guest lecturers and have enacted so-called safe spaces where conservative ideas are regularly not allowed to be voiced. Students across the political spectrum report that faculty express more liberal views than conservative views in class. So it's not something that only conservatives are reporting. In fact, very liberal students are even more likely to say that they've been in a course where faculty express politically liberal views. I don't think I have to convince you that there's a liberal bias in Hollywood and entertainment, do I? And even sports is nothing sacred anymore.
So we have religion, we have education, we have social life, we have power structure, we have labor relations, unions, and finally we have law and order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? These are the areas of application of subversion. What it means exactly? In case of religion, destroy it, ridicule it, replace it with various sects, cults, which bring people's attention, faith, whether it is naive, primitive, doesn't really matter. As long as the basically accepted religious dogma is being slowly eroded and taken away from the supreme purpose of religion, to keep people in touch with the supreme being, that serves the purpose. Therefore, replace it, accepted, respected religious organizations with fake organizations. Distract people's attention from the real faith and attract them to various different faiths. Education. Distract them from learning something which is constructive, pragmatic, efficient. Instead of mathematics, physics, foreign languages, chemistry, teach them history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, your sexuality, anything, as long as it takes you away. Okay? Social life. Replace traditionally established institutions and organizations with fake organizations. Take away the initiative from people. Take away the responsibility from naturally established links between individuals, group of individuals, and society at large, and replace them with artificially, bureaucratically controlled bodies, whom nobody elected. Never. As a matter of fact, most of the people don't like them at all, and yet they exist. One of such group is media. Who elected them? How come they have so much power? Almost monopolistic power on your mind. They can rape your mind. But who elected them? How come they have a nerve to decide what is good and what is bad for the elected by you, president, and his administration? Who the hell are they? Okay. Together with that, there is another process. Law enforcement, law and order organization and structure is being eroded. For the last 20, 25 years, if you see old movies and new movies, you can see that in new movies, a policeman, an officer of the United States Army looks dumb, angry, psychotic, paranoid. A criminal looks nice, kind of, well, he smokes hash and shoots the whatever drug, but basically he's a nice human being. He's creative. And he's unproductive only because society oppresses him. Whereby a general of Pentagon is always, by definition, a war maniac. A policeman is a pig, rude policeman. He abuses his power. You know? A generalization like that. The hatred, the mistrust to the people who are supposed to protect you and enforce law and order. Moral relativity.
So I'm going to be putting up some graphs here right now, and I'm going to lay out how I believe the parties have changed in recent decades. I'm going to give a short description of the general voter base of the parties. And on my descriptions of the parties, however, I will be referring to politicians, not voters. I'm going to try to say nice things about the old Democratic Party and what I don't like about the new Democratic Party, and vice versa for the Republicans, because I used to be a Democrat, and now I kind of lean Republican, so that's how I'm going to do that. So how the party have moved in recent years. So old Democrats, and here's what the coalition really is. Democrats of all flavors: liberal, moderate, conservative, liberal Republicans, and classical liberals. A pretty broad coalition of voters, and that's one of the pluses that I have. They embraced a broad coalition of voters. And in many ways, they were really just liberal Republicans. The gap between the parties ideologically has widened significantly in the past few years, even just the past 5 years since Trump's been in office. And so, traditionally, one of the things that separated Democrats from Republicans was that Democrats favor a more hands-on approach of government intervening to solve financial crises. And this traces all the way back to the Democratic President FDR's New Deal. And what I have as a negative is that some of the corrupt elements in the party tended to go unnoticed due to the public perception as well as generally favorable media coverage, right? People are more likely to expect that a Republican is corrupt. They don't really see it coming, as much with Democrats. Now, the new Democrats, and I have, they're sort of liberal Democrats, democratic socialists, paid actors, talk show hosts, mainstream media pundits, anarcho-communists, and, various other people. But, okay, here's what they do. Number one, exploit underdog cultural status in order to use identity politics to divide population. Division equals D votes. 2. Expel conservative dissent from the party to consolidate base through division. 3. They must now placate a fast-growing socialist communist base with radical elements. 4. They take increasingly anti-American stances and anti-constitutional steps in government. And lastly, they use media control in order to project their dirty politics on the other party. Okay, so now we're going to do the Republicans, and again, I'm going to say things that I didn't like about the old Republicans, and I'm going to try and say things that I do like about the new Republicans, all right? And again, I'm going to describe the voter base, but these things I'm talking about politicians, not voters. Okay, so old Republicans, right? Conservatives, country clubbers, business class, libertarians, the religious right. Right, I'm talking Bush Republicans, McCain, think like those guys. Their core beliefs are going to be the bedrock of the new coalition, but they differ a whole lot. While they favor small government in part, they were more than comfortable to nearly always protect authorities and businesses in violation of the law, while also feigning a naive trust in authority. The Republicans did perhaps just as much to increase Big Brother government, but mostly in the realms of defense, intelligence, and surveillance. And, it just has to be said, many corrupt elements were blatantly pro-war and obviously profiting from it. That's a huge negative. Okay, but let's look at the new Republicans, right? Think like Trump Republicans, populists, libertarians, constitutionalists, you know, a broad coalition of pretty much anybody who's, you know, pro-free market and anti-commie. Alright, so they're similar to old Republicans in core conservative beliefs, small government, pro-free market, pro-constitution, pro-USA, and American traditions. They're now firmly anti-war, anti-surveillance state, strong on individual liberties, and have a populist messaging on economy and jobs. There's been high turnover rates in the party due to internal corruption purges and rapidly evolving voter base. A record number of Republicans are not running for re-election, and even big names such as, you know, think Paul Ryan. And so obviously an element of corruption remains, like in every political party. But what I'm saying is there's a lot of things I like about the new Republican Party, and I definitely am leaning more Republican than Democrat at this point. So the pendulum swings, equal and opposite reactions, right? So youth are inherently rebellious and will almost always trend in the opposite direction which society points them. If both your parents are Republican, you're more likely to become a Democrat, and vice versa. Rock and roll was viciously attacked by pop culture in the 50s and 60s, and the result was that the youth population embraced the rock culture. Consider a pendulum swinging. We have culturally been swinging towards the Democratic Party for roughly half a century. I believe we are beginning to see the swing back the other way. This is partially why younger voters often find themselves jaded with the Democratic Party and more inclined to identify as independents than previous generations. So my conclusion, yeah, people my age have grown up in a cultural environment dominated by one political party. For people my age, it is not obvious that the Republican Party represents the establishment, and all clues point in the other direction. The younger generations are going to rebel against the liberal hegemony, which controls their education, and frankly, quashes all dissenting thought. You know, I've experienced it myself. I just graduated from college this past year. I am not in any way suggesting that the Republican Party is perfect or always has been. I'm not registered to either party, and it is important to stay skeptical of all authority. But anyway, let me know what you thought of the video, anything that's on your mind. But with that being said, it is just the general course of events that the pendulum is going to swing the other way. And I think it is important that we as, you know, as former Democrats, as young people, as whatever you want it to be, that, you know, we make sure the pendulum is going to swing back, but it doesn't have to be more polarizing. It can be less polarizing. And, you know, we just want everybody to get along again. You know, I do. I know you do. So what happens when pop culture marries itself to the platform of one political party? While at the same time, we've seen the degradation of pop culture reach extremes unheard of. It's pretty simple. The younger generations will rebel against it. As Huey Lewis in the News said, it's hip to be square.
You like Huey Lewis in the News?